This breakdown is lit, or is it? Hello everyone, I'm Sarah from Everyday Starlet. Welcome to my channel. I make videos to inspire you to be the star of your own life. I'm continuing my Masculine Feminine Energies film breakdown series with Gaslight. If you're not familiar with what I mean by Masculine Feminine Energies, I have a ton of videos diving into this content deeper, but a brief summary. Masculine and Feminine Energies are energies that live within all of us. We all contain both energies, but we all have a core energy that's when we're most ourselves in. We can be in wounded or healed versions of either of these energies, and each of these energies contains archetypes. And we all contain all of the archetypes within us, so we can tap into whenever we need to. I have a lot of videos about the masculine and the feminine archetypes if you want to learn more. And in order to have sexual polarity in a relationship, you need one partner to be in the masculine and one partner to be in the feminine, because opposite energies attract sexually and same energies repel sexually. So let's get into Gaslight. It shocks me that this movie is not more popular. This film is from 1944. It stars Ingrid Bergman and Charles Boyer. It is not just an incredible movie, but it is actually where we get the term that we hear so often today, gaslighting. It came from this movie, which is actually the reason why I wanted to watch this movie, and I am really surprised that this is not a more popular movie, because there are so many important lessons in this movie for people to pick up on. This movie is from 1944, but it actually is set in like the Victorian era in London. And for those watching who are more in my age group and even a little bit older, this was actually Angela Lansbury's first on-screen role. So if you remember Angela Lansbury from Murder, She Wrote, it's so cute to see her as like this kind of sassy little maid. But this movie is the epitome of what it means to be in a psychologically abusive, narcissistic abusive, or a sociopathic relationship. If you are somebody out there who does not believe in psychological abuse, that people can be coerced or mind manipulated or things like that, or you're one of these people that's like all adults are just responsible for their own decisions, and yes, as adults, we are responsible for dealing with the consequences of our actions. However, we can't discredit the idea that there are people who are acting in ways that are not in line with their character because they are being manipulated. And a lot of it can happen from trauma and things like that. And if we don't actually factor some of these things into the equation, we set people up for failure, and we actually end up very often blaming the victim in some of these situations. So if you don't believe that people can easily be manipulated and mind controlled, watch this movie, because it is a prime example of how subtle it can really be. Like, abuse does not have to be a person hitting somebody else. That is abuse, obviously. It does not have to be sexual assault. Obviously, that is abuse. Abuse can come in other forms as well, and those are all things we need to be mindful of, because oftentimes psychological abuse is something we don't even know is happening to us. You know, we don't even know it's happening until somebody wakes us up. And that's not actually just in romantic relationships, which is what's happening in this movie. But this happens with governments can do this to their people. They've done it in history. You could argue some are doing it now. This can happen with media manipulation. It can happen in advertising, corporations, workspaces. It's one of the biggest messages that I hope comes across with my content. I want people to feel like they should be able to question things. If any group, organization, or person cannot accept you questioning something or using your gut instinct to ask questions, inquire things, and they want to shut that down, that's a warning sign. That's actually something that I've really noticed, I think culturally. It's one of the blockages that I have with people who are sort of red-pilled. There are a lot of people that are waking up, you know, from the matrix, if you want to call it that, which I think is wonderful, because I think a lot of us need to. But unfortunately, if you wake up from government corruption, media corruption, you kind of wake up from the matrix, but you end up pushing yourself into another limiting box of ideologies that you can't question, which is what a lot of the red pill content kind of tends to be. Some of these traditional relationships, and I'm not judging that stuff, but a lot of the like extreme traditional, I don't want to label religions, but there are certain religious organizations and things like that that fit people into just another structured ideology to control people. And if you just trade in one manipulative group of people that you've been following for another manipulative group of people that you're following, that still is not letting you question and use your own intuition and letting you make your own decisions with your life, you're really just trading in like one evil for another evil. And I'm not saying that everybody in government is evil, or everybody in certain religions or certain groups or that call themselves red pill, or people who are in a certain organization or anything. I'm not saying that they're all evil. However, if you're in a situation, any kind of situation, where you're not allowed to question what's going on or question anything, that may be a warning sign that you may not be in the right place. I do believe that this film, Gaslight, which is where the term gaslight comes from, which I'm going to get into deeper, I do think this movie should be a must-watch for everybody. Although if you are someone who is inclined to manipulate someone, this movie could really teach you some tricks on how to manipulate someone. So that's the caveat. But if you are someone who has been in a psychologically abusive relationship or a narcissistic relationship, or you're afraid that you might be, or you're afraid you may have been, or something like that, or you're afraid of being susceptible to them, this movie can teach you a ton of lessons. With another caveat, if you are someone who is healing from any kind of abusive situation, particularly one that has been psychologically abusive or things like that, please be mindful of where you are in your healing, because this movie could be triggering for you. I found it very validating for myself in my part of my healing process. I want you to tune in with yourself and really figure out where you feel like you are in the healing process. And if you feel like watching a movie that is blatantly showing psychological abuse and manipulation, if you feel like that's going to be too painful for you right now, honor that. I want my content to be inspiring and can actually teach you some lessons, hopefully get you to tune into your own intuition and help you learn what to question, what to look for, and things like that. But I never want my content to be harmful to people. So if you feel like watching a movie that is really a psychological thriller about mind control and manipulation is too much for you to handle right now, honor that. Or if you do really want to watch it anyway, please make sure that you have some support system around you, that is someone that you trust that you can talk to if it does bring up stuff for you. I also think too, if you have kids, this could be a really great movie to watch. I don't necessarily think this movie might be, depending on the age of the kids, it might be a little heavy for children, but watching this movie and actually seeing some of the signs of psychological abuse and manipulation and things like that may help you know what to talk to your kids about, as far as making sure that they don't end up in situations where they are getting manipulated or abused. One of the biggest takeaways I think you can get of a movie like this, I mean, this kind of manipulation and abuse, it can happen to anybody. However, it does tend to be something that somebody who has trauma or a lot of instability in their childhood or in their youth, they can very often fall into these patterns a little bit easier than other people, because they tend to be seeking things outside of themselves to fulfill loss or pain or something like that from their youth and their childhood. So, you know, if you are a parent and you're watching this, giving your child as loving a home as you possibly can, and making sure that they have as loving a stable home life as you possibly can provide for them, is going to make it easier for them to know when something is off in their life when they become adults. So the backstory of this movie is that Paula, played by Ingrid Bergman, which I actually have a breakdown of Casablanca, her most iconic role. It was one of the earlier film breakdowns that I did, so that's here on my channel if you want to check that out. Paula has had a very traumatic life, really. Her mother died when she was just a baby, and she never knew her father. So she was raised by her aunt, who loved her very much, but her aunt was actually a very famous opera singer. So she lived a very extravagant life in this fancy home in London, and it was a very glamorous life. Unfortunately, her aunt was brutally murdered, and Paula was the one who walked in and found her aunt dead in their home, and the case was never solved. Paula was sent to Italy to study with her aunt's best friend and music teacher to train her to be an opera singer as well. It's interesting how even in the very opening scene where Paula is being sent to Italy and they're telling her, like, don't look back, they're really just telling her to just forget everything and suppress it. So part of this is a time period thing. I mean, things like therapy and stuff like that were not common back in those days. So when you did have trauma in your life, you were just told to suppress it, hold it down. And when you keep suppressing trauma and you don't have an outlet for it, it's gonna start coming out in other ways, usually in very self-destructive ways. So Paula is studying music and kind of doesn't really feel like she's ever gonna be as good as her aunt, and she's basically a little bit lost which, you know, we all go through that. But when people are going through a period where they're lost, particularly for women, we can very often latch on to something outside of us that gives us a direction, and very often that's a man. If he's a good man, that's not necessarily the worst thing in the world. Unfortunately, if he's not a good man, that's where you start to have a problem. So Paula meets and falls in love with Gregory, played by Charles Boyer. And Gregory is dashing, and Paula keeps saying she feels a sense of safety with him, but she is very conflicted. And her music teacher actually points out that she seems very distracted, that her heart is not in music anymore. And Paula basically, you know, confesses that she's in love. It is interesting because in that time period, it would be normal for a woman to give up her career path, or, you know, her life, to dedicate her life to being a wife to a man when she met a husband. Right or wrong, whether you agree with it or not, in that time period, it would be normal. And you see that as a theme too in a lot of period films and things like that. In this case, it seems a little odd because, like, we saw this in The Phantom of the Opera. It was this idea of somebody had success and they were following the path in their career, but when it was determined that they were getting married, that's when the woman would kind of walk away from what she was doing to dedicate her life to being a wife, because in those days, once you became a wife, it was pretty likely you were gonna become a mother pretty soon. In this case, it kind of seems like Paula is putting the cart before the horse. So she's really kind of giving up a lot of stuff, and they don't say it specifically, but she seems really quick to throw away the music and throw away what she has going on for this man that she's fallen in love with. And it's implied that he wants her to stop making music. I don't know if he ever specifically says it really, but it's kind of implied that she feels like she needs to give that up to be with him, which on its own, some people may make that decision on their own. There are some people who voluntarily give up everything in their life to be with a person. However, when you watch the movie as a whole, kind of get the impression that he probably pressured her to give up music, or convinced her that she should give up music, because he consistently throughout the movie wanted her to give up anything that ever mattered to her, really. So even though at that point in the film we don't really know exactly how that conversation went, I think very often, particularly with the feminine, because if you're feminine at your core or you're operating from your feminine energy, you're gonna put love and connection, your relationships first above everything. So oftentimes when a woman is in her feminine, whether it be healed or whether it be wounded, she can very easily want to put her partner, her love, her relationship before everything. However, when you actually leave everything else in your life and you abandon everything else in your life just to be with your partner, or you feel like you have to abandon everything else in your life to rely solely on your partner, that's usually a sign that you're in wounded feminine. You're not in your healthy feminine energy, because when you're in your healthy feminine energy, you don't have to give up every single thing in your life just to be with your partner. That's not what a relationship is. I mean, no relationship can survive if two people are only focused on each other all the time, particularly if you are a feminine cored woman and you're looking for a masculine partner. He's going to need to put his passion and purpose first. The masculine puts his passion and purpose above everything. His relationships will be second to that and will be in the highest support of that. Whereas the feminine, we will have our love and connection as our first priority. That doesn't mean we can't have passion and purpose. We just usually will always, it's the reason why, like, most women, no matter how career driven they are, if they have a family, like, they'll drop everything if their kids are sick, because to them, taking care of their family, their nurturing, their loving, their relationship is always gonna feel like it's the most important thing. Not to say that women can't have other passions. So when you end up in a relationship where two people need to only have each other, that's usually a sign there's some wounding going on there, because as humans, none of us can rely solely 100% on getting everything from one person. You know, I think that's where we get the line of codependency starts coming in, where people start throwing around codependency when anytime anybody wants to rely on their partner for anything. It's like, well, no, if you're gonna be in partnership with someone, you're gonna wanna rely on them for certain things, you know what I mean? But if you solely rely on one person to get all of your needs met in every single area of your life, that's more of a codependency. Like, that's where it becomes dependent. While it wasn't unusual in that time period for, you know, someone like Paula to back away from a sort of career path she was on in order to settle down and be in a relationship, the fact that she was so quick to throw away everything in her life just to focus on this man is a bit of a red flag. Also, the fact that she was hesitant. Like, she was in love with him, but she was questioning it. But she wasn't trusting herself to question it. And she decides that she wants to go away to a lake to take a trip to just like connect to herself and figure things out. Gregory says okay, that he's okay with that. But then he shows up while she's there to surprise her. This is a tricky thing, right? It's a tricky thing because, as I mentioned in another video, I think it was my Thin Man breakdown, that very often when the feminine says she just wants to be alone, she just wants to be alone, what she actually wants is for her partner to prove to her that he actually wants to be there. She doesn't actually want him to just leave her alone. And that's typically true. And she is excited when Gregory does show up and surprises her. Here's where it gets tricky. And this is where, as a woman, you have to tune into your intuition. That's why it is so important to really be able to be a clear channel for tapping into what your ego or your neediness or, you know, that kind of energy, your wounding, your trauma, what that's telling you, and like what your soul truth is telling you. Because let's be real, in the beginning, Paula's gut is kind of warning her. Like, she's falling for this guy, but her gut is kind of like, oh, I don't know. Like, she can't put herself fully in. And it is normal to question, it absolutely is, but a lot of that questioning is her gut instinct that's telling her something is off here. She's young, she's been traumatized, she's never worked through that trauma, so she's latching on to this guy. She keeps saying that she feels so safe with him. She's never felt safe. Her fear is gone. Like, she's relying on him for all this stuff that she really needed to work on within herself. And yes, you should always want a partner who you can feel safe with. You don't want to be with a partner who makes you fearful. But if you're relying on that person solely to be the only way that you can feel safety and security, you can't tap into that within yourself, that's where it starts to get into some codependence, right? So here's where there's a fine line here when it comes to kind of pushing a man away and him fighting to come back to you. As a woman, right, if you're doing this thing where you're pushing a man away and you want to feel him fight for you, if he does come to you, really important to tune into why is he coming to you. And it's subtle. If he's coming to you from a place of, okay, I know that you're going through a lot of stuff right now, I want to be here for you and I want to hold space for you. And he's the masculine, I'd say the masculine container. He's the cup that wants to hold your flow that's going on within you. Because like the masculine is the cup and the feminine is like the water in the cup, right? So you're kind of flowing around and everything, and he's like, I want to be the safe space for you. I want to hold the safe space for you. Like, that's why he's there. I want to show you my stability. This is something I talked about in the Thin Man breakdown, where I believe it was Dorothy was going through all this emotion and she was pushing away her future fiance, and he was like, no, I'm here for you. Like, I'm here for you. I'm grounded. Like, that's what you want to look for in a partner. However, in this situation where you have somebody like Paula who is like, I'm unsure, I don't know what I'm doing, I'm kind of like, all of this is happening too fast, I'm unsure, and you have Gregory who is intentionally not letting her have her space because if she thinks too much, she may change her mind. So this is his neediness. Like, he needs the control over her. He can't let her actually take a breath and tune into her intuition and tune into what she thinks and wants, because he's afraid if she thinks about things too much, he won't be able to control her. Classic psychological manipulation tactic. You can't let people stop and think. You have to keep people constantly distracted, because if they're not constantly distracted, they'll think, and they may start to think for themselves, and they may start to tune into their gut instinct, and that's when they start to question what the person's doing. It's a classic mind manipulation technique. I actually saw this documentary years ago. I don't remember what the name of it was. It was something I just randomly saw on TV. It was actually about cults and how, as different as cults are, and they range, you know, in so many different spectrums, but the techniques that cults use in order to lure in people and to keep people in the cult are shockingly similar. Like, there's literally a playbook for it. Basically psychological manipulation. And one of the key tactics I remember reading is when you join some kind of a cult-like organization, they keep you so busy. They tend to get you sleep deprived. When they keep you constantly busy, you don't have time to like stop and think about what you're doing. you just keep going, and when you end up sleep deprived, you can obviously get into psychosis and things like that. You could argue that that's what social media and streaming networks and things like that are doing to us. They are literally putting us in a constant state of distraction and a constant state of being sleep deprived. How many people lose sleep because they spend all night scrolling, or lose sleep because they're marathoning through, ironically, shows about cults and serial killers and things like that? It keeps us sleep deprived. We are much more easily manipulated by really everything in the world if we're sleep deprived and we're constantly kept stimulated and we don't ever get to tune into our own gut intuition. So that's why it's so important as a woman when you have a man who's willing to be there for you. If you are a woman who is looking for a relationship, you're looking for a loving partner, having a man show up for you is obviously going to feel wonderful. You have to tune in against your gut instinct and really figure out why he's showing up for you. Is he showing up for you because he wants to be that grounded, safe space for you? Or is he showing up for you because if he lets you stop to think for a second, you won't be able to think for yourself and he won't have control over you? And oftentimes, you may not be able to tell that right away. I mean, your intuition will always know, but if you're not used to trusting your intuition, sometimes it can be really hard to distinguish that. That's why it's important to take things slow in a relationship and pay attention to what's going on around you. And you can feel excited and happy that a man showed up for you, but don't get so caught up in, he showed up for me, he must be the one, I'm gonna automatically trust him completely 100%. Like, you can enjoy when he does show up for you and he does do what you want, and also keep paying attention to how he's showing up and how his other behaviors are. And that's really important, to stay awake and alert. Enjoy the good things, but don't get so caught up in the good things that you ignore the bad things. It's also too on that trip where it's a very subtle distinction that Gregory asks Paula kind of like what she envisions they do with their life together. And she starts out with like, I think it's, I like to go to Paris, I think was what she said. And he was like, oh yes, Paris. And then he starts listing all these other places. And then he goes, and London. And he starts going on and on about London to the point where, and he knows at this point, but she doesn't know that he knows, that she actually owns her aunt's home in London, this big beautiful home in London. And he starts telling her about all of the things that he loves about London, how much he's always dreamed of living in a place in London. And she's like, I own a house in London. Oh, I can give this to you. So he actually so subtly shifted the conversation from him asking her what she wanted to now all of a sudden changing the conversation into her offering him everything that he's ever wanted. It was subtle there. And I highly recommend that you watch that scene because it's a really subtle way he does that. Now, in a healthy relationship, both people would be expressing their wants and needs, their hopes and dreams, and that would be completely normal. What's not normal is when one person takes their hopes and dreams and literally manipulates the other person into thinking that their hopes and dreams are the same, right? So like, both people can share their hopes and dreams, and some may be more attainable than others, and some people may have to decide, you know, if two people dream of living in two different places, if they really want to make a relationship go, they may have to figure out how they can make that work. However, if two people have different kind of hopes and dreams, and one person is essentially manipulating the other person into thinking they have the same dream, that's where it gets dangerous. And even if it's not a psychologically abusive situation, although that would be considered psychological abuse, but even if that's just an isolated incident on its own, eventually the person who's being manipulated is going to wake up and be like, hey, all of these dreams that I had are not happening, because they think they're getting what they want, because they're kind of being told that their dreams are happening even though it's not their dream. They're kind of getting caught up in the other person's dream, and I think that that will definitely build resentment. And you want to know the biggest thing that deteriorates a relationship? It's resentment. You know, both people should be able to express their hopes and dreams, and some people may have to compromise in certain areas on different hopes and dreams and things like that. However, you have to be really careful of not letting somebody manipulate you into thinking that their dream is your dream, because eventually you're going to end up resenting them anyway. So they end up moving into the aunt's home, and it ends up bringing up a lot of fear and trauma in Paula, understandably so. Obviously, she literally witnessed you know, her aunt just after she was murdered in this home. It had a whole lot of childhood drama for her. She's back in this home because she believes that this is what her husband wants. And it's interesting how in the beginning Paula is so vibrant and excited. She's in love. I mean, there's really nothing more beautiful than a woman in love, right? She just glows. Even, I mean, no matter what her attractiveness level, obviously Ingrid Bergman is gorgeous, but like when a woman is in love, she simply glows. And she's so excited, and she wants to show Gregory London, and so she's so excited with, you know, them going out and seeing the town and everything. Gregory gifts Paula with a brooch. He claims it's a family heirloom from his mother, and she goes to put it on and the clasp is broken. Interestingly, he says he'll get it fixed. Now, he could have gotten the clasp fixed first before he gifted it to her, but he didn't do it that way. Wouldn't have been a big deal, except that then she can't put it on because she might lose it because of the clasp. So he says to her to keep it in a safe place, essentially. He says, because you know you have a tendency to lose things. And she goes, oh, I do? I didn't know that about myself. It's laying the groundwork, right? It's little digs like that, because she's shown no evidence of forgetting things. Maybe she has in the past, but we're all human. People forget things, right? It's those little insults and the little jabs. He does that throughout and they get more intense and they get worse as they go along. If someone is constantly picking at your flaws, it's often a sign that they're trying to get you to believe that your flaws are there. So it's the subtle, like, you usually forget things, and she was like, oh, I didn't know that. So what he does is he tells her where to put it on her. He doesn't say he'll keep it in a safe place. He has her keep it in what, you know, they pretend is a safe place, and then she can't find it. We find out later in the movie, spoiler alert, it's not that surprising, that he stole it. He does this throughout the movie where he'll do something and then essentially blame her, and she starts to think she's going mad. He'll hide things around the house and then accuse her of stealing something or moving something or something like that. She won't remember doing it, but she's constantly thinking that, like, oh, I must have, because nobody else did it. The reason why the movie is called Gaslight and why the term gaslight came about, because all of this behavior in there is gaslighting. That's essentially what it is. Back in those days, you actually lit a gas lamp in order to light the room. And when the light was lit in one room, if somebody lit a gas light in another room, then the lights in all the rooms would dim. So Paula would be in the house either by herself or just with the maid or something like that, and the lights would dim, and she would freak out because she would be convinced that there was somebody else somewhere in the house, but she could never find anybody else in the house, right? She would hear footsteps, she would hear all these things, so she thought she was going insane. The maid was a little bit hard of hearing, so she never heard these things either. Paula was just constantly convinced that she was going insane. Interestingly enough, that Gregory would keep telling Paula she was ill. At one point they hire a maid, and the maid is talking to the cook and says something like, oh, the missus doesn't seem like she's ill. Is she ill? And she says, well, the master keeps saying that she is. Again, he keeps telling her she's ill, and when you keep telling someone something over and over and over again, eventually they're gonna start to believe it. That's where the mind control comes in. That's where you start to get this manipulation. And when people say, well, why didn't they just leave? Or why didn't they just walk away? Or, oh, well, they're adults, they made the decision themselves. Yes, we need to be alert and aware and responsible for our decisions and our actions. However, when you have someone who you believe you can trust, and maybe you've poorly put your trust in, but you believe you can trust and you want to believe you can trust, and they're constantly feeding you this stuff. They're feeding you things that are lies, that are untrue. Like, you're constantly told every day that you're ill. Eventually you will become ill. And this is actually a medical phenomenon. I know when I was caring for my mother when she was going through breast cancer, and they said that the day you start treatment, they call you a breast cancer survivor, because they want you to be in a survivor mindset and not in a victimhood mindset. That's why it is so crucial to be really strong in your thoughts, to really work on your limiting beliefs, because these limiting beliefs can manifest themselves. If you believe that you're dumb, you're probably going to do dumb things. If you believe that you're unattractive, you're going to be less attractive. If you start to believe that you're beautiful, that you're smart, that you're talented, that you're lucky, if you start to believe these things, you are truly going to manifest more of these things into your life. And, you know, this isn't just some kind of, like, you know, woo-woo law of attraction kind of thing. I mean, this is real. I mean, we know this from this mind control, is that when you constantly feed people negative information, they start to believe it. And Paula really does start to believe that she's ill, and she really does start to believe that she can't function. And Gregory keeps her so isolated. One of the scenes that really breaks my heart, and This ties into, I have a video talking about how narcissistic abuse can affect your feminine energy. I dive into this much deeper. A lot of people have said that that video was very helpful for them, so I highly recommend you check that out. But, you know, Paula has felt very isolated in this house because Gregory has kept her very isolated and doesn't want her out talking to people, right? Very common tactic of people who are psychologically manipulating you. They keep you very isolated so other voices and other people can't get in your head, right? They need to have the control. He tells Paula that he's gonna take her out on the town, and she's so excited. She's so vibrant, she's glowing. I mean, there is absolutely nothing more beautiful than the feminine again, when she's in love, when she's in pleasure, when she's glowing, when she's happy. She's dancing around the house, and now to a truly masculine partner, that joy and pleasure and excitement is going to be the sexiest thing he's ever gonna see. Like a truly masculine man, when he sees a woman in her full feminine radiance, is going to be the most attractive thing he's gonna see. And a masculine man is going to want to do more to bring out that same energy within her. He's gonna want to bring out that joy, that excitement, that pleasure, because it's gonna fill him with joy and pleasure, because that's why they're together, right? The feminine is like the flower. Why do we love flowers? Like, I mean, yeah, they smell nice, but a lot of things smell nice. They're beautiful, but a lot of things are beautiful, but flowers bring us joy, you know? And that's one of the things that the feminine brings to the world is her joy, her radiance. Paula is so in this joy and radiance. However, somebody who's psychologically abusing and manipulating someone will have to destroy that, because they cannot have someone in that joy and radiance and pleasure. And you see this in sociopaths, narcissists, and things like that. Part of it and part of the belief is because people who are sociopaths, definitely, and people who are narcissists, they can't truly feel anything, really. Like, we think of them as not having empathy, but they really don't have much feeling. Sociopaths don't have any feeling whatsoever. Narcissists, there's different schools of theory about that, but a lot of people believe that narcissists just, they cannot actually enjoy things. They can't really bring full joy to anything, so they have to destroy other people's joy. I'm not going to dive into the whole idea of narcissists and sociopaths in this video, because I just want to talk specifically about the manipulation. But when you have someone who's more of a sociopath, a narcissist, that kind of thing, and they see someone in that joy and pleasure, they're going to have to ruin it, which is going to kill your feminine energy, right? Because if you then feel like anytime you're in that joy and pleasure, someone tries to ruin it, you're gonna be afraid to show that, right? I go into that deeper in my other video about narcissism and destroying feminine energy. But in this situation, you see it very blatantly, where she is in this joy and pleasure and this feminine flow. And then I think that's the moment he switches to the photograph. He does a few different mind games, and I think that's the photograph one, where he shifts into where the photograph go. He's essentially hidden a photograph on the wall and accuses her, and you know, she says she hasn't done it. Actually, I think he flirts with the maid first. There's a moment he flirts with the maid and tells her how beautiful she is. That's another mind manipulation tactic, where you won't insult your partner, but you'll constantly compliment somebody else in front of your partner to make your partner feel inferior. Sometimes you don't even have to say it. That's what I really believe a lot of these guys that need to scroll through half-naked women on Instagram while they're in a relationship, or you know, they're talking to other women, or they're talking about other women, or they're watching OnlyFans girls, or they're watching porn, or things like that. It's a way of basically telling your partner, hey, you're not enough for me, you're not good enough for me, I'm actually interested in these other girls. And women read that as, oh, you want me to be like these other girls, or else why would you be paying attention to these other girls and not paying attention to me? Same kind of thing, right? So he is blatantly complimenting the maid in a very flirtatious way in front of his wife. The wife gets very uncomfortable. He accuses her of stealing a photo off the wall. And interestingly enough, you know, she freaks out. She's all upset. Interestingly enough, she knows right where the photo is, and she can't figure out why she knows right where the photo's hidden. He is like, well, how did you know where the photo's hidden if you hadn't hid it? And she's like, well, that's where it was the other times that it was missing. She knows where it is because this has happened before, and he keeps convincing her that it's her that did it, even though it wasn't her that did it. But she starts to believe it because this is constantly happening over and over again. At that point, she becomes so upset. He basically says he's not taking her out now because obviously she's not well enough to go out in public. So he takes away that thing he dangled in front of her, which, let's be real, he never intended to take her out in the first place. So he dangled that little carrot in front of her, destroyed all her hopes and dreams, and then convinces her that she's the reason why they can't go out and do the thing that she really wanted to do. So then he says he's gonna go out because he just can't deal with it. So then he goes out without her and leaves her there and convinces her that she's not well enough to go out. Another instance, they're invited to this big event that was actually a person who was good friends with her aunt, and Gregory basically writes to them and says that Paula's not well. Paula decides she wants to go. She thinks she's well, she wants to go, and Gregory basically says he didn't think it's a good idea, and Paula says, well, I'm gonna go anyway. So he's like, well, of course I'll go with you, as if like she starts to stand up for herself, and now he's like, okay, I'll go along with this a little bit. But then they go to this event. He ends up manipulating her again, and she freaks out, and now he drags her out and is like, see, this is why we can't go out in public, because now everybody knows that you're crazy. Like, he's making her crazy, and the fact that they went out in public so people saw her snap, even though he's the one that made her crazy, he convinces her that everybody else thinks that she's crazy, even though he's the one that made her crazy, right? It's classic technique of convincing the person in the relationship that's being manipulated that they're the problem. So fortunately for Paula, there's this detective who apparently had met Paula's aunt years ago, and he starts noticing that things just don't seem to be right. And he knows that the case was never solved, so he starts investigating the case and figures out what's been going on and confronts Paula. Paula defends her husband so much and is so afraid. It's actually interesting because when the detective comes into the house and Paula's freaked out because she doesn't want her husband to know that this other man was in the house. And actually earlier in the movie, Paula finds a letter that was written to her aunt, and Gregory freaks out about it. And of course, we end up finding out that he wrote the letter. Paula brings up the letter later on, and he actually convinces her that she thought there was a letter there, but there was no letter there. And it wasn't really a letter. And then she ends up finding the letter in his desk, along with the brooch and all these things he was hiding. But it's interesting how when the detective comes to help her, she is so freaked out, like, what's my husband gonna think, what's he gonna say? Like, she's terrified of what's gonna happen to her. Of course she is. That's one of the things that people forget about abusive relationships when people try to intervene, and this is one of the reasons why I'm not somebody who's gonna sit here and be like, girl, leave, just walk away. Sometimes walking away, just walking away, is not always the safest thing to do. Do I fully believe that if you believe you were in an abusive situation of any kind, that you should try to take the steps in order to leave safely? I would absolutely encourage you to do that. I would. I want you to know that you deserve to be treated with love and respect, and you deserve someone who's not going to abuse you. You do. Everybody deserves somebody who is not going to abuse them. However, I also understand, particularly when you've been in a situation that is psychologically abusive, so it may be difficult for you to really know what's been going on with you, but also if you're in any kind of abusive situation, then just up and walking out may not always be the safest thing. And I don't ever want anybody to take the steps that actually put them in more harm's way. Paula is freaked out about what her partner is gonna think, because she feels so nervous and unstable about what's going on, and she thinks she's the problem. She's now so worried about her husband's safety. She's putting that before her own. She's just worried about so many different things, and some people are just not ready to take that step. I encourage you, if you are in a negative situation, to please own your worth enough to try to, as safely as you possibly can, take the steps towards getting out of it. That said, I also understand that sometimes just packing up and leaving may not be the safest thing all the time. If you are in a situation where you do feel like you are being psychologically abused and manipulated by somebody, or abused in any way, I highly encourage you to reach out and get help from somebody who is trained to know how to handle the situation. Now in Paula's case, luckily she has a detective there who knows how to protect her, how to investigate the situation. He ends up showing her actual evidence as to what her husband has been doing to her. He fills in the blanks for her, and that's when she starts to wake up. She still questions it a lot. She's still very hesitant about it. In fact, Paula has been told that her mother died, I believe it was in childbirth or when she was an infant. Gregory actually tells Paula that he did research, which he didn't do, but convinces her that her mother actually died in an insane asylum and that she was insane too. He just made that story up. And since Paula didn't really know her mother, she didn't really have any way to argue against it. So Paula was convinced that somebody was going to take her away and put her in an insane asylum. Luckily, somebody like the detective cared, for one thing, and also knew how to handle the situation so that he could show Paula what was actually going on, and he could get Paula some help. Obviously it's a different time period, so she probably would need a lot of therapy assistance and things like that to recover from the situation. But spoiler alert, Paula does end up confronting her husband and actually seeing what's going on. Now, most people are probably not going to experience the extreme levels of manipulation that Paula was experiencing in this movie. However, I'm willing to bet that many of us have experienced the levels at the beginning. The subtle digs as to flaws in a person that just come from out of nowhere. Like, if somebody's never lost anything before in their life and someone's like, well, you know, you're forgetful. And you're like, I didn't know I was forgetful. And they start saying that. Now, it's a little different than in a situation if somebody is forgetful and it's bothering the other person. It's not good to dig at somebody. Like, that's never a positive thing, but I know sometimes we can have a tendency to do that. That's not exactly mind control. It's just not healthy, right? But if these digs and manipulation are out of nowhere, you know, I mean, if someone is actually acting lazy and someone's just like, well, you're being lazy, that's not exactly toxic behavior. Is it the best way to go about communicating to somebody that they're being lazy? Maybe, maybe not. However, if you're not a lazy person, if you're always actually doing something and somebody starts being like, well, because you know you're lazy or because you know you're forgetful, and it's not something that you actually know that you have a history of, and you actually look at your life and go, I'm not lazy. I mean, I used to have this experience too with my ex where I remember him constantly telling me that I was so selfish. He was trying to convince me that I was so selfish. I believed it because it was this old story that I'd had from childhood where people would convince me I was selfish, even though I was always doing things for other people and I was always living my life for other people. Anytime I ever needed or wanted anything for myself, I was called selfish. So I had, you know, manifested this relationship with a man who was basically perpetuating my childhood trauma. He would constantly try to convince me that I was selfish, and I would believe it because I had been told that before. And when I actually sat there and looked at my life and was like, oh my God, every single thing that I am doing in my life is literally for another person, and I'm not actually getting anything that I want in my life, but I'm giving to everybody else, and now I have this person telling me I'm selfish. What I'm being told isn't aligning with what I'm actually doing. Now, if I was actually always doing for myself and never thinking about another person and someone called me out and said, hey, you're being selfish, that's a different story, right? So I think when somebody makes a dig at you or makes an insult, which is probably something that we've all experienced, think of it as a wake-up call. Be like, okay, this person said I was lazy or forgetful or selfish or something. Sit with it. Like, okay, especially if it triggers you. If it triggers you, maybe they hit a nerve, maybe they didn't. Maybe it was just an insult and it hit you the wrong way. Or maybe it's so untrue that it bothered you. But I think taking it and being like, okay, why did they say this? And then actually look at, okay, was I actually exhibiting laziness, forgetfulness, selfishness? Was I doing that? And if you can honestly say to yourself, I'm not doing that, well then they may be trying to project ideas into your head. They might be trying to manipulate you. You don't know. Instead of just believing everything someone tells you, I think when someone tells you these things, it helps to take a look at these things. This wasn't specific to this movie, but a very common manipulation that happened to me. I think I've mentioned this in a few other videos talking about narcissistic abuse and psychological abuse. I know, like, my ex used to, every time he wanted something, he would always refer to, like, we want this, or it was we or us or something, every time it was about him. So then when I would come to him and say, okay, well, what I need is this, he would turn around to, well, it's always about you. See, I'm thinking about us and you're just thinking about you. And I would be like, oh my God, you're right. Like, you're right. Oh my God, I am thinking about, you're thinking about us and I'm thinking about me. Until I realized that I was like, wait a second, his like we and us stuff is only his needs. It wasn't taking any of my needs into consideration. So his manipulation of me, which I already kind of believed from being told that in the past, that I was selfish anytime I didn't just drop everything and do something for somebody else, he fed into that story of convincing me that I was selfish, when in reality, he was being at least equally as selfish, but he was using the words that could make it look like I was the one being selfish. And obviously there's different levels of manipulation, and not everybody who is manipulative is automatically a narcissist or a sociopath. Not everybody that gaslights somebody is automatically narcissistic or a sociopath. If you are dealing with somebody who has narcissistic personality disorder or is a sociopath or psychopath, you can guarantee there's going to be gaslighting. Guarantee you there's going to be gaslighting involved. Some of these things, these manipulations and some of this gaslighting things can exist outside of a psychologically abusive or narcissistic abusive relationship. Unfortunately, a lot of dating advice out there, I think you see it a lot with a lot of these like alpha male podcasts and stuff. I know I attack them a lot, but I think their information is very toxic, particularly to young men, but I think it's really dangerous for teaching young men how to manipulate young girls. A lot of dating advice out there is teaching people how to manipulate people. So I think there's a lot of people out there who are manipulating people and actually trying to mess with their brains. If any of you are from like my age group, you may remember the book The Game. They actually made like a VH1 show about it and stuff like that. It was a book basically teaching men how to be pickup artists, and it was using a lot of these tactics. It was using mind manipulation tactics to get women, and I think a lot of men have learned these mind manipulation tactics in order to get women, and it is incredibly dangerous. And that's why I really want women especially, because I think women and children are much more susceptible to this kind of manipulation, although we as a society are susceptible to it because a lot of us are having this kind of mind control manipulation happening to us in the media, with our government, things like that. We're all susceptible to it, but particularly women and children tend to be much more vulnerable to this kind of stuff. So I want people to be aware of what the warning signs are. And while this video wasn't specifically just about masculine feminine dynamics, the reality is a masculine man is not going to manipulate you. A man who's in a healthy masculine energy is not going to manipulate you. This is very wounded masculine behavior, really. This kind of mind control and manipulation falls much more into the wounded masculine, because you're abusing people. When you're in your wounded masculine, you tend to be very abusive, and it tends to find people who are in more of their wounded feminine, because the wounded feminine tends to be very self-abusive. So that's the kind of dynamic you end up finding people in. A stable masculine man is not going to try to manipulate you. He's not going to try to harm you. He's going to want to protect you. Ideally protect you from people who are going to manipulate and harm you. Women are not going to be able to fully flourish in their beautiful, vibrant, radiant feminine energy if they're in a manipulative relationship, because relationships like this deliberately destroy and control that kind of beautiful, radiant feminine energy. The feminine is not meant to be isolated, which is a key component to this kind of manipulation. The feminine is not meant to constantly be suppressed. She needs to be able to open her heart and feel safety and be able to flow freely. If we don't work on trying to avoid being in relationships like this, or trying to avoid being the person in this manipulative relationship of manipulating or being manipulated, we're not going to be able to fully flourish as our masculine feminine core selves in a healthy relationship dynamic. The lack of healthy relationship dynamics tends to traumatize people as a young child, and then they grow up, and if you've never experienced a healthy relationship dynamic, so you don't know what a non-manipulative relationship is, it's going to be harder for you to be able to identify that when you become an adult. Big wake-up call for me was actually having a conversation with a woman who did not grow up with a lot of psychological abuse, and she's actually somebody who is like a PhD therapist. Said one time that she had been in one narcissistically abusive relationship, and she knew right away something was off. She didn't know right away what it was, and she's somebody who's trained in this stuff, but she didn't know right away what it was, but she knew it was off. And luckily she got out before things got too bad. But because she had been in healthy relationships in the past and growing up, she was much more able to figure out that something was off in an unhealthy relationship. So the healthier our relationships are in childhood, the easier it is to identify the unhealthy patterns as we get older. Now, if we have not had great role models of healthy relationships and healthy parenting and things like that when we're younger, it just means that we have to start doing the work to really pay attention to these signs, and we may have to just be a little bit more aware of our surroundings and aware of what our patterns are, so we can actually learn to seek out those healthy relationships, so we can break the generational curses and not just keep ending up in the same relationship patterns over and over and over again, and not bring our children into the same unhealthy relationship patterns. Because a lot of this stuff can be healed and avoided when we have kids that grow up in relationships that are as healthy and stable as we can possibly give them. Which, if you think about it, I really do believe is part of the reason why our whole society is trying to break down the family dynamic. Because if you break down the family dynamic and you get a lot of kids that are used to broken homes, they're more easily manipulated. Not just in romantic relationships, but by the media, the government, corporations, things like that. Yeah, this movie, I cannot believe that this movie is not more popular, and the fact that the actual term gaslight came from this movie, and it is such such a perfect example of what gaslighting and psychological abuse and manipulation is. Highly recommend people check this out because there's so much in this movie people need to be aware of and pay attention to. It's also an amazing movie. It's beautifully done. The acting is phenomenal. The movie itself is absolutely phenomenal. So if you feel like you are in a space where you can handle something that might possibly be triggering, I highly recommend that you watch this movie after you watch this video. See if you can pick up on some of the things that I mentioned. If you enjoyed this video and found it helpful, please give it a big thumbs up and be sure you subscribe to my channel. If you're a woman who would like to learn to connect to her feminine energy, I have online courses, details in the description box below, along with links to all my social media accounts. If you have any thoughts on this topic, this video, anything, I'm always open to respectful comments if you want to have a discussion. I absolutely encourage you to question everything and feel comfortable questioning everything. So yeah, I'd love to hear from you, and if you have any other video suggestions or film suggestions, let me know. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I hope you join me next time.